First and foremost, thank you very much for joining this presentation this evening. Before we begin this presentation, we do provide land acknowledgement in which Indigenous tribes and bands have been with the lands that we inhabit today throughout Oregon and the Northwest since time immemorial and continue to be a vibrant part of Oregon today. We would like to express our respect for the first peoples of this land, the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon: Burns Paiute Tribe, Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, Silesia Indians, Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation, Coquel Indian Tribe, Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Clackamas Tribes. It is important that we recognize and honor the ongoing legal and spiritual leadership between land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. The interconnectedness of the people, the land, and the natural environment cannot be overstated. The health of one is necessary for the health of all. We recognize the pre-existing and continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place and thank them for continuing to share their traditional ecological knowledge and perspective on how we might care for one another and the land so it can take care of us. We commit to engaging in a respectful and successful partnership as stewards of these lands, and as we are obliged by state law and policy, we will uphold government-to-government relations to advance strong governance outcomes supportive of tribal self-determination and sovereignty.
Okay, excellent. Stop recording.
As Jesse shared, I am part of the Department of Land and Conservation and Development, also known as DLCD. You'll hear me abbreviate that throughout. For those who might be less familiar, DLCD is a state agency that implements policies and regulations for the land use planning throughout Oregon. Now, this is achieved through 19 goals, which express the guidelines for local comprehensive planning and land usage for various purposes and environments. So we have particular goals that are geared towards processing, those that have strictly or focus on particular resources, certain goals that focus in urban areas, and other goals that focus on the coastal range. And that's where the Oregon Coastal Management Program, or the OCMP, comes into play. They help oversee the goals that address within the coastal zone. Now, OCMP is a subdivision of DLCD, and it was approved by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 1977. So this entire coastal zone starts from the coastal range all the way out to 3 nautical miles into the territorial sea. And so this jurisdiction has 7,000 square miles. It encompasses the long 362-mile coastline, 22 estuaries, watershed land for 8 counties and 32 cities. We actually cover a little bit of the Columbia County. Now, as I mentioned, DLCD has 19 goals. The coastal range, or the coastal zone that OCMP helps manage, is 4 of them, goals 16 through 19. And as you can see, goal 16 addresses estuarine resources, goal 17 addresses coastal shorelands, goal 18 addresses beaches and dunes, and goal 19 addresses ocean resources. So as I'm sure you are all aware, we're going to be focusing on the statewide planning goal 18, which addresses beaches and dunes. Now let's take a moment to understand that the Oregon coast is very diverse and that we can see different types of beaches surrounded by various landforms. And majority of that coastline is actually compromises of sandy beaches, 72% of the coastline to be exact. And this is what makes goal 18 essential for land use planning within this jurisdiction. Now, the dynamic coastline is consistently changing. However, the formations that we see today are due from geological events from thousands and thousands of years ago, where it was initially thought that there were islands off of the Oregon coast, to as well as anthropogenic or human influences from recent decades. Development has manipulated the profile of the coastline and to what we see today. And from that, we better learn and understand on how we can manage and still utilize these resources today. Now, it might seem quite trivial, but we should start off with some affirmative definitions, such as what is a beach? We're all quite familiar that a beach would consist of some sand and some water, but for DLCD, we define a beach as a gently sloping area of loose material that extends landward from the lower water line to a point where there's a definitive change in the material type or landform. So that would be one example of what a beach is. But we can also see the change in material type from other components such as established vegetation. So in this example, we see a much smaller definitive beach. So with that information, I'll give you 5 seconds to get an idea as far as where the beach is for this image. We have an idea of where it starts, pretty much right at that water line, but where does it end? Where would we define where the beach is? If that was your guess, congratulations. You can give yourself some bonus points. If you weren't quite accurate with that, that's quite all right. Keep in mind, this is where we would define the beach to be in that moment that that picture was taken. We have other events that occur, such as storm surges or any type of erosion changes, and we have to redefine as far as where that beach line is based in the moment. Now, when it comes to dunes, they're actually not always affiliated with being near water or associated with the coast. There's dunes of variable shapes and sizes and seen throughout the globe, as well as various places throughout the nation. As some of you might be familiar with, the Oregon Dunes National Recreational Area in Reedsport, but we also have some other famous dunes within the United States, including the White Sands National Park in New Mexico. So with these highly variable landforms, how do we define a dune? What is a dune? Well, a dune is a hill or ridge landform developed by sand or sediment. This is built up from the wind or water moving loose sediment from usually offshore and bringing it up onto the land. Now, since dunes can be very variable, it's important for us to understand the components or parts of a dune. So we'll first identify the foreslope, which is the windward facing side of the dune, the one that's most likely exposed to the ocean elements. We have the crest of the dune, which is the highest point or the tallest point of the dune. And we have the slip face, which is the leeward side or the non-windward side of the dune. It's less likely to be exposed to some of the elements blowing in from offshore. And so with that information, we have another little game for you folks. Please try to identify within this dune picture where that foreslope, crest, and slip face is located. 2 more seconds. And if this was your guess, congratulations, give yourself some more bonus points. And once again, we're going to state that these environments are ever changing. In the moment that this photo was taken, this is where we would be identifying those components of the dune. Now, there are actually several different types of dunes, but we are going to be focusing on what's called the Foredune or the frontmost dune. This one parallels the beach and is most likely to change due to a variation of elements, whether that's from natural events or anthropogenic influence. Now, with these foredunes, we actually provide them as a little bit of a status or based on their condition. So the image on the left-hand side, where we have sparsely vegetation and grass growing along it, we would say that's an active dune. It's very probable for it to shift and to change, again, either from human influence or from natural events. While the image on the right-hand side, we would say that's a conditional dune. We have a lot of dense vegetation there that's essentially stabilizing the dune, collecting a lot of sediment, and we wouldn't see a drastic change within this dune unless a significant event occurred. We also do have dunes that we would classify or provide a status as far as being older, and those are the dunes where we see other types of vegetation becoming more established, such as trees and shrubs. Now, what comes after this Foredune? We can see various different types of landforms following this Foredune. We can see multiple dunes show up, and we would identify that as a dune complex. We can also see development. In some cases, we would actually see development occur on the dune, which we will address that much later. And then we can also see low-lying flat areas known as deflation plains, and these areas tend to seasonally flood. Just making sure I don't have any comments and that folks are doing all right technical-wise. So now that we have an understanding as far as what a beach and dune, what these landforms are, let's go into their importance. Why are beaches and dunes important? Why should we care as far as if they change and they shift? Well, they serve many important roles for us as well as for the environment. First and foremost is dunes act as a barrier or help absorb a lot of wave energy or activity. The image you see on the left-hand side has a little bit more of sandy structure it has a little bit of rock, but it predominantly has a beach and a sandy dune to it. And we can see that wave energy more so sequester into that landform versus the image on the right-hand side, which is a seawall in Depot Bay, a lot of rocky structure surface area. That wave energy reflects, and that reflective wave energy can impact not only that area, but adjacent areas. And for certain areas along the Oregon coast, those adjacent areas could consist of natural areas, other development, or downtown areas. Another important component to our beaches and dunes is they do help reduce erosion, or the rate in which sand or sediment wears away from the landform. And now this is quite important considering these dunes provide flood protection qualities for whatever's following the Foredune. So in this example, we just see my little illustration of a development, but to provide a little bit more real context, the image on the left-hand side is a dune, and we can see it's a little bit more tactile, more opportunity, so that even as sand starts to erode away from it, it has the opportunity to be captured still on like little other stilts or points below it or at the base of it. Versus the hard surface structure image on the right-hand side, anything eroding away from that is instantly falling down to the beach profile and then swept out, most likely with the next higher tide. Now, for those of you who might be curious, well, how about shoreline armoring? Wouldn't that be a helpful fix? We'll get into that a little bit later on, but I will simply state it's not the simple nor easiest solution. Actually, when it comes to shoreline armoring, we can see beach profiles really reduce or narrow in size. So there comes a little bit more with a compromise where if you put in shoreline armoring to help reduce erosion rates, you end up losing that beach, which is supposed to be available to the public, and it can eventually come to the point where it's inaccessible to the people. Another important feature to our beaches and dunes is they have the ability to sequester or absorb blue carbon. Now, you might be wondering, what is blue carbon? Blue carbon is actually the carbon taken in from the atmosphere and placed within tidal wetland areas, such as beaches and dunes. And this new emerging research is actually seeing that tidal wetland areas, such as beaches and dunes, are able to sequester or absorb in this carbon at a rate 10 times higher than terrestrial or inland environments. So this is really important, especially if we start to see these landforms start to shift and change. That carbon could be re-released back into the atmosphere. Now, the thought as far as why these landforms are better at sequestering blue carbon, there's some thought as far as the idea that there's a lot of decay and breaking down material within these landforms. Thank you for the comment. We'll address that later on. Now, this blue carbon process is actually bolstered by the help of the vegetation that we can see among these dunes. First, I'd like to share and address a native species that used to be a little bit more prevalent along the Oregon coast, and it was known as American dune grass. Now, this native species was actually really slow to establish. Originally, we would normally see it very sparse, not densely distributed along the Oregon coast. And so it wasn't capturing the sand at a sufficient rate. So in the early 1900s, that was trying to be resolved by introducing other grass species and in order to help bolster the vegetation and help grow these dunes so that they continue to protect development in other areas behind the Foredunes. Now, one of those type of species that was introduced was the European beachgrass. It's seen all along the Oregon coast, all the way from the northern tip down to the southern end. And this particular species was selected because it was seen to help increase or aid in dune height. So it made that crest go a lot higher. Now, with this particular species, it establishes very quickly, and we see it abundant all throughout the Oregon coast. Another species that was introduced was the American beachgrass. Please don't have that confused with the Native American dune grass. There is a difference. The American beachgrass was introduced in the 1930s. It has been seen to help aid with dune width or make them a lot wider. So it takes a lot more energy or higher waves in order for those to overcome those dunes. But we predominantly see this present among the northern coast of Oregon, as well as along areas in coastal Washington. Now, due to the introduction of the two grass species, a hybrid species has evolved. This hybrid is known to grow taller compared to its parental species, and it has been observed to aid in both dune height and width. Furthermore, it's been observed to be much more competitive compared to its parental species, and there's some suggestion as far as whether or not we'll start to see this hybrid more prominent along the Oregon coast in years to come. Now, for those who might be a little bit confused as far as how do you identify between all of these species that all have a green blade, well, we're going to try and make it simple for you folks. We're going to tell you to look at the ligule. The ligule is the little piece of tissue at the base of the leaf or the blade of the grass. And depending upon the length of that ligule, will help you identify what species that grass is. So to show it as far as ligule length in order, say ligule length 10 times fast if you can. The American grass species, both the native dune grass as well as the introduced beach grass, have the shortest ligule length of roughly 1 to 2 millimeters. For those who may not be too sure as far as how long a millimeter is, it's about the width of a paper clip. The hybrid species has an intermediate ligule length of roughly 7 millimeters, and the European beachgrass has the longest ligule length of roughly 25 millimeters. Now, if you really want to know the difference between those two American grass species, it's just by the difference of 1 millimeter. So that native dune grass technically has the shorter ligule length of 1 millimeter, a ligule length of 1 millimeter. And the introduced American beachgrass has a ligule length of roughly 2 millimeters. I'll give you folks a little bit of a size comparison with the image on the right-hand side. And we also do open it up and introduce people to this course or this group available on iNaturalist. This is actually assisted and aided by CoastWatch as well as by partners with Oregon State University. For those who are a little bit less familiar on what iNaturalist is, this is a great community science program in which anyone can create an account and then you provide images. Now, these images are verified by experts among these groups to help you confirm if what you took a picture of is what it is or what you think it may be. So it helps you better identify your species, but then you are also help contributing to science in the sense when you submit these pictures, you do provide a location, and it helps the long-term monitoring process as far as getting a better idea on the distribution of these species and where they're seen. So again, for this group in particular, it's focusing on the beachgrass mapping among the Pacific Northwest. Now, as we're talking about vegetation, we also must include one other important feature to our beaches and dunes, and that's the habitat availability to our wildlife. We see various different types of wildlife. We can see quite a few invertebrates such as crabs and clams among the surf or beach area. There's various different types of avian species that utilize the beach, either whether they're long-term residents or short-term residents, migrating species. All parts of the beach are really important for habitat. Among the vegetation, we can see other wildlife such as insects or bugs. Let's keep in mind that among these dunes, we can see more than just grass species. We can see flowering plants as well as shrubs. And then among these dunes, we can actually see various types of mammals, including small mice or rabbits in certain parts, as well as up to larger mammals such as coyotes or even elk. Now, speaking of wildlife, certain areas along the Oregon coast, certain beaches or dunes, may have certain restrictions because of wildlife. There may be sensitive wildlife, such as the western snowy plover. I believe we're at the further end of the plover nesting season. Now, these particular birds are considered to be endangered. They're about the size of a golf ball or a cotton ball. And they actually prefer really flat beach areas with minimal vegetation. And that's because due to their size, it's a struggle for them to get around on the beach, particularly for the chicks. So even something as like a foot depression could be quite a hoof for some of these birds to actually wander and to navigate among the beach area. Now, as we get into our component, as far as addressing the development along the Oregon coast, I am discussing the recent development along the Oregon coast, and we want to have a recognition of cultural context in which Native people have resided and utilized beach and dune environments since the time immemorial. We strongly encourage Oregonians and others to learn about the people indigenous to Oregon through their own platforms, as they provide a lot of information and their own stories as far as with the Oregon coast. Now, between the natural beauty and the resources among the Oregon coast, the demand for development furthered and the demand to further develop along the coast have become increasing in recent decades. As towns and businesses expanded, so did the request to build among or near beaches and dunes, which influence a lot of change in the environment. So we can see this drastic change between these two images. We kind of see a change anyway because one's black and white and one's colored, but we can see as far as how much more expansive the development has become. Now, due to a lot of this development, commonly vegetation was removed, including grasses and shrubs and trees. And then they started to see a shift in the coastal dynamics. They started to see beaches erode away, dunes start to become a little bit flatter, and particular areas such as estuaries were really becoming quite a problem. So a response to that was to build a jetty in some of these estuaries. Now, jetty can be beneficial in some cases, but it's definitely not always beneficial in every situation. As some of you may be aware of a town called Bayocean. This town was established in 1906 among the Spit in Tillamook County. And when they started to see the sand and sediment erode away from the Spit area, they decided to put in a jetty. However, they only had the funds to build the northern part of the jetty. And so by only having in the jetty in the northern half of the estuary, a lot of the sand and sediment began to accrete or collect on the northern part and erode away from the actual peninsula that Bayocean was developed upon. And due to this, we actually started, the town started to fall into the sea in the 1920s, with the last building falling in 1971, which was said to have been a garage. So as far as with the more so recent understanding of what kind of changes have occurred due to development and the importance of these beaches and dunes, we now have our Goal 18. And so what exactly does Goal 18 establish? Well, first and foremost, it requires there to be an inventory of this coastline so we can help identify areas and monitor any sort of changes. For example, we do have our partners at the Department of Geology and Minerals Industry, also known as DOGAMI. They are updating a map. So our maps used to be what you see on the left-hand side, that green color image that doesn't really provide too many details. And they've updated it to the image and the layout that you see on the right-hand side. Now, they've accomplished Tillamook County. They are going to do this for the entire coastline, but we can see how much more advanced this mapping is for people, counties, and cities to better identify areas and know what it is that they might need to do if development were to occur or if development should not occur. I do provide a map, or excuse me, a link along the bottom, the nanos.org beach mapping link. I can provide that within the chat at the end of the presentation so folks can better click upon that. So another purpose to Goal 18 is to set policies and standards for land use. And this is strictly to aid in the protection and conservation and restoring resources. We want to make sure these resources are going to be available for all as well as for future generations. And we're going to implement requirements when it comes to development. So one of those requirements for development is to restrict shoreline armoring. As you can see within this image, the shoreline armoring was not successful for this particular area. They actually restrict development of any shoreline to any restrict shoreline to development that's prior to 1977. And now, mind you, jumping to this seawall type structure isn't the first step. When it comes to shoreline armoring, there's various different types where you can start off with small cobblestone to cement blocks, and then it further goes on from there. But you need to, if shoreline armoring is to be allowed, you need to start with those first few steps. Another land use activity that's regulated underneath Goal 18 is dune grading. And this was a process in which sand was removed from the crest of the dune, and it was predominantly for the Foredune, and that was to prevent sand inundation to homes, as we can see with the image on the right-hand side. Now, with that, because of the protecting flood protection features of dunes, there are strict regulations when it comes to dune grading. First and foremost is this can only occur on the Foredune, and that's the frontmost dune. And there needs to be a Foredune grading management plan implemented before any type of activity or construction is being done. And that management plan needs to have several things factored in. And one is that the height of the dune still has to be greater than 4 feet over the base flood elevation. That base flood elevation is established by FEMA. If dune grading is to occur, it needs to factor in the entire area. And this is to ensure that single lots or single homes aren't trying to dune grade, because if you grade in one area, it influences and affects the whole adjacent area. So the dune, any sort of grading management plan needs to factor in a significant size of that area. Also, you want to identify areas within there that will need buildup of sediment, because that sediment can't be removed from the beach or the dune system. We can't take sediment from Northern Oregon and bring it down to Southern Oregon. That does lead to the introduction of other species, invasive or not. So that's why we limit that. And then if Foredune grading is occurring, it needs to be established as far as what stabilization measures are going to occur. That's commonly as far as planting other grasses in order to establish the dune back again. But mind you, it can't just be said that we're going to plant. You're going to have to provide the method in which you're planting, how you're going to monitor it, in which it's going to, in order to ensure it will be successful. And that if that doesn't work, what's your alternative plan? So there's a lot more to it as far as with dune grading, and goal 18 helps establish a lot of those rules and requirements before that can even begin. Now, as the state agency continues to protect and conserve these natural and cultural resources provided by the beaches and dunes, we are encouraging individuals to participate in other ways or sharing what you can do about it in order to bolster these efforts and ensure that these valuable landforms are appreciated by future generations. First and foremost, if we recall that the beaches and dunes were used at a time during immemorial by natives, and it's possible to come across some cultural resources, artifacts, or even remains. And by state law, you are not allowed to touch them, remove them, or displace them. If you do come across anything of the sort, you are allowed to take photos, and please note the location. However, please do not advertise that location. We ask that you provide that information at the email listed here on the slide. The State Historic Preservation Office will contact you as far as to ensure, so they can clarify as far as where those resources are located in order for them to make sure that they're returned to the appropriate tribe or individual. Another thing that you can do is please stick to designated paths. As we can see with this image, we can have this designated area in which people can come and go. And then we see that people have created a new pathway here along off to the side. We kindly ask that you do not do that for multiple reasons. One is that, you know, it's unsure as far as whether or not that pathway leads to a hazardous area. You know, that's not established by the state. Also, it takes years for that growth and only a foot for it to die. We definitely need that vegetation to still densely grow in order to further stabilize and support these landforms. Also, by creating more new pathways, it's assumed that the state is aware about them. And the reality is we can't be aware of all those new pathways. We have established accessing points that we try to monitor and ensure that they are being kept up with, and it becomes much more difficult as more and more people create different alternative pathways. Also, we ask people to stick to those designated paths is because some of those makeshift areas could end up leading to people to restricted areas. And we want you to respect those restricted areas. They could be restricted for a number of reasons. There could be some erosion happening, there could be new vegetation growth, or there could be sensitive wildlife such as the western snowy plover. If you can see within that image of the one adult western snowy plover, just beneath it is a little chick. And so there are areas that are closed off for seasonally. Another thing that you can do is contribute to community projects. Everyone can be a community scientist. There are various different projects that you can contribute to with many different groups and agencies. As an example, the Oregon King Tides Project, as Jesse mentioned earlier, we do jointly help manage this. This is an annual event in which the highest of high tides occur during the winter months from November, sometimes up through February. And these high tides occur due to the alignment of the Earth, Sun, and Moon. And with these higher tides, we can see quite a few changes occur along the dynamic coastline. And since the coastline is 362 miles long, it is very difficult for one or even two agencies to help monitor that. So we do rely upon community scientists such as yourselves to help us better monitor this. And in fact, every year we do have a photo competition with several categories for Oregon King Tides Project. And then these images are stored within a database for us to help assess long-term monitoring that our GIS folks help and establish so that we can get a better understanding and have a baseline with how things are changing in previous and recent years. And with that, I'm going to provide you with my contact information, which is listed right on top. I'm also providing you our coastal shore specialist, Rhiannon Bazora, as well as our coastal policy specialist. If you have those particular questions, especially if it's in relation to a particular location, Rhiannon as well as Meg will both have more information about that, especially if it's about previous activities. And with that, I'm going to open it up to some questions in relation to what I presented upon. And thank you everyone for your time and your patience.
Okay.